everybody, welcome back to Anna Reads. I hope you like my Jumbo Junior Disney Bound for today, including blue eyes. Did you know that Jumbo Junior was animated with blue eyes deliberately to make him further resemble a human infant? I'm speaking, of course, of Dumbo, but I really try not to use that rotten stage name. His mother called him Jumbo Junior, so Jumbo Junior he is. Before I go on about that for the rest of the day, let's hop right back into Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. And today we have Unit 1, Chapter 3, so strike that, reverse it. All his remembered years had been spent amid the calm fields and country lanes of a farming town. Now the boy saw broad boulevards filled with trolleys and automobiles. The buildings climbed 8 and 10 stories, and the theaters glittered with 1,000 electric bulbs. Noise was everywhere. The call of street vendors, the rumble of beer drays. Can we bring back beer drays, please? Can we? Fire wagons clanging down cobbled streets. The city was unsettling in its strangeness, but the 8-year-old Walt Disney found it exciting as well. Among his vivid early memories of the city was Fairmount Park, a place of amusement 2 blocks from his first Kansas City home. To a boy of 8, it seemed like a pleasure palace with its gleaming white buildings and its sounds of music and excitement. But Walt never got past the whitewashed fence. There was no money to lavish on such frivolity. The Disneys first lived at 2706 East 31st Street in a house with cramped rooms and a privy in the backyard. Please check my first book read, Unmentionable by Therese O'Neill, for details on, well, how that worked. I believe it's chapter 2. Elias Disney's health precluded the hard labor he had known most of his life. He bought a distributorship for the Morning Times and Evening and Sunday Star newspapers, paying $3 apiece for 700 subscribers. Walt and his sister Ruth were enrolled at Benton Grammar School, and soon Walt joined Roy as delivery boy for his father. Oh, hey, there's the mail. Coincidental, that. Walt arose at 3:30 and claimed the newspapers from the delivery truck at 4:30. The Star and Times had been reluctant to give a franchise to Elias Disney because of his age, 51, and he felt he had to prove himself. He wouldn't allow his boys to deliver from bicycles throwing the newspapers on porches. He insisted that they lay the papers on the doorstep, making sure that the wind would not carry them away. During the winter time, the papers had to be placed behind the storm doors. For 6 years, Walt delivered the newspapers morning and night, missing only 4 weeks because of illness. In the beginning, he carried the papers in a sling over his shoulder. Hello, Luther. Excuse me. Right. Oh. All right, where were we? Later, his father supplied a pushcart. The pushcart wasn't big enough to accommodate all of the Sunday papers, and after his first delivery, Walt returned to the distribution point for another load. The newspapers had to be distributed in rainstorms and blizzards. Many times young Walt fell up to his neck in snowdrifts. Where do you think you're going? During storms, he welcomed the end of his route when he visited apartment houses. Then he would make his deliveries from floor to floor in the steam-heated hallways. The warmth was so alluring that he sometimes sat down in a vestibule to take a brief nap. He always awoke in panic, puzzling over whether he had finished his deliveries in the building, fearing he would be late for school. Until late in his life, Walt Disney had a recurring dream in which he suffered torment because he had failed to deliver some newspapers along his route. The other newsboys were paid for their deliveries, but not Roy and Walt. Their father gave them small allowances, but nothing for carrying the newspaper. "Your pay is the board and room that I provide for you," he declared. Both boys considered that unfair. They believed that a day's work deserved a day's pay, even if the boss was their father. Roy, who was 19 and had graduated from high school, could no longer tolerate his father's domination and his frequent outbreaks of temper. "He still treats me like a little boy," Roy complained to Walt. Roy decided to follow the course of his two older brothers and run away from home. One summer night in 1912, he told Walt he was leaving to help with the harvest at their Uncle Will's farm in Kansas. "Don't worry, kid. Everything will be all right here," Roy said assuringly. In the morning, he was gone. Roy's departure placed more responsibility on Walt. When other boys proved unreliable, it was Walt who had to substitute for them or make a special delivery for a lost paper. When Elias added a new kitchen, a bedroom, and a bath to the Disney home, he insisted that Walt would help him. Elias had his own ways of working, and he grew impatient with Walt. "No, you don't saw the board that way, you saw it like this," the father would say angrily and slap the back of the boy's pants with the side of the saw. On such occasions, Elias struck out with whatever was in his hand, a length of board, the handle of a hammer. Walt learned to run when he saw such outbursts coming. His mother intervened, telling Elias, "How do you expect Walt to know these things? He's only a boy." It really makes me wonder how much of the monologue delivered so wonderfully by Tom Hanks in the 2013 film Saving Mr. Banks was based in reality. From what I'm reading in Chapter 3 here, quite a bit of it. Walt discovered his own amusements. When the circus came to the city, he followed the parade from beginning to end, his sister Ruth striving hard to keep up with him. He devised his own circus parade, enlisting Ruth and the neighborhood children to help decorate floats atop play wagons. When Ruth became ill with the measles, he amused her with drawings, including a series of figures that seemed to move when papers were flipped. At 9, he had made his first attempts at animation. Walt took a boyish delight in playing tricks on his parents. He was fascinated with magic tricks, and one day brought home a small rubber bladder that could be inflated through a long tube to make a plate rise. He tried it first on his mother's pots in the kitchens. She was startled, then delighted, and she tried the stunt on her husband at dinner that night. Elias was too occupied to notice, but Flora was so convulsed that she had to leave the room. One day, Flora answered the front door to find a nicely dressed woman. Flora began to converse with her until she recognized some of her own clothes. The visitor was Walt in his mother's clothes, a wig, and makeup. I really want to know where he got a wig good enough to convince his own mother in those days. I really do. Flora Disney brought a note of gaiety to what was often a gloomy household. Elias had been perplexed by the defections of his 3 sons and disheartened by the repeated failures of his enterprises. His thrift was extraordinary. He would walk miles rather than pay a nickel for the trolley, yet he continued with his unpromising investments. He could convince himself that a mining stock or a new invention could lead to riches. He was always thinking up new ways to make money. Remembering the sweet butter on the farm, he arranged for a Marceline dairy to send him a regular supply. Flora loaded the butter into a cart and sold it door to door. Walt accompanied her, but she insisted on pushing the cart herself. The route took them into the well-to-do district where some of Walt's classmates lived. The embarrassment was something the boy did not soon forget. Most of Walt's school years were spent at Benton Grammar School, and they provided lifelong memories. I really wish Walt had done a book similar to Boy Tales of Childhood by Roald Dahl. Just hint, hint, look for that one in future videos, okay? He reminisced in a 1940 letter to a one-time teacher, Daisy A. Beck. I often think of you and the days I spent at Benton. I can plainly see you and school principal J.M. Cottingham coaching the athletic teams for the annual track meet. I don't know whether you remember or not, but I participated in several events and even won a medal one year in the championship 80-pound relay team. I was kept rather busy with my paper route and didn't have much time to train, but I did manage to get in on a few events. Do you remember that time I brought the live mouse into the classroom and you smacked me on the cheek? Boy, what a wallop you had. But I loved you all the more for it, and I can still plainly see the kids marching single file into the classrooms to the rhythm of the piano in the hall with you and Miss Catherine Shrewsbury standing over the radiators while the heat billowed out your skirts. It looked very comfortable to me on those cold mornings, and sometimes I wished that I might have worn skirts myself. I remember how Cottingham would break in on any classes if he had a new story, and all work would cease until he had his fun. He had his faults, but I still think of him as a swell fellow. I can imagine a book being very similar to Boy Tales of Childhood now that I think of it. Walt's record at Benton Grammar School was undistinguished, despite his mother's coaching with his homework. Teachers complained that the boy's attention wandered, that he failed to follow the normal curriculum. Part of this may have been due to the exhaustion from the early morning regimen of newspaper deliveries. Excuse me. Glasses plus headband pushing on my head. But Walt seemed unwilling to conform to the ordinary methods of learning. His reading of the classroom assignments was perfunctory, although he made good use of the public library. He read everything of Mark Twain, whose Missouri childhood had been similar to his own. He was engrossed by the success stories of Horatio Alger and the adventures of Tom Swift. The storytelling of Robert Louis Stevenson, Sir Walter Scott, and Charles Dickens also intrigued him. You can't chew my glasses, cat. Walt's abiding interest was drawing, but even in that field he could not please his teacher. When his fourth grade teacher, Artina Olson, instructed the class to sketch a bowl of flowers on her desk, she strolled around the room and stopped at Walt's desk. He had drawn human faces on the flowers with arms where the leaves were supposed to be. The teacher chastised him for not following the assignment. I could spend the rest of this day, not to mention the rest of this video, telling you similar stories about my own school experience. But moving on. He continued to draw things the way he saw them. His earliest efforts duplicated the political cartoons he found in Appeal to Reason, the socialist tract his father subscribed to. Walt became accomplished at portraying the top-hatted capitalist with gold watch across his bloated belly, the oppressed laboring man in work clothes and square paper hat. He developed an ease for caricature, and one day he drew impressions of the patrons at Bert Hudson's barber shop. The barber liked them so much he asked Walt to draw a new caricature every week. His work was framed on the barbershop wall, and Hudson cut Walt's hair for nothing. Excuse me, there's cat hair on my nose. Pardon me for being ungraceful. His drawing skill helped cement a friendship with a schoolmate at Benton, Walter Pfeiffer. The two boys had become acquainted at school. One day, when Walt went to call on his new friend, he was told that he had the mumps. Since Walt had already had them on both sides, he was allowed to visit his friend. He brought along paper and charcoal, and he showed Walter how to draw. Walt became a steady visitor at the Pfeiffer house. Mr. Pfeiffer, a jolly German whose laughter filled the house, was an official of the United Leather Workers Union. His daughter Kitty played the piano, and he liked to have the whole family join in song. Mr. Pfeiffer adored the theater, especially the Dutch dialect comedy of Weber and Fields, and he rattled off the jokes with gusto. After the austerity of his own home, Walt was overwhelmed by the warmth and gaiety of the Pfeiffers. He began spending more time at their house than he did at his own. Through the Pfeiffer family, Walt Disney was introduced to an enticing new world of vaudeville shows and motion pictures. Elias Disney had always considered such entertainments to be frivolous and time-wasting, so when Walt and Walter Pfeiffer started going to the theaters, Walt was careful not to let his father know. Around the piano at the Pfeiffer house, Walt and Walter recreated the jokes and songs they had heard in the vaudeville houses and imitated the pantomime of the movie comics. With Mr. Pfeiffer's coaching, the two boys devised routines to perform at Benton School. Walt induced other students to wear funny costumes and repeat the jokes he had copied from the vaudeville comics. His most popular performance was Fun in the Photograph Gallery. I would give anything for footage of these sketches, by the way. Walt portrayed an antic photographer posing his fellow students, then dousing them with a jet of water from the camera. The audience was delighted when Walt produced the photograph, his own caricature of the student who had been squirted. On Lincoln's birthday, when he was in the 5th grade, Walt converted his father's derby into a stovepipe hat with cardboard and shoe polish, borrowed his father's church deacon coat with swallowtail, added crepe hair to his chin and a wart to his cheek. Just for everyone who might not be versed in this particular bit of Lincoln's birthday, or bit of history, Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday both fall in the month of February. Lincoln's birthday on February 12th, Washington's birthday on February the 22nd. Before we celebrated President's Day as a 3-day weekend, both were celebrated as different holidays and they were marked in red on a calendar. If you are ever curious about this, brace yourselves and go look up Irving Berlin's Holiday Inn. You might regret it, I'm not going to lie to you, but you will indeed experience a piece of American history. Content warning. Principal Cottingham was so pleased with the impersonation that he took Walt into each class for a recitation of the Gettysburg Address, a ritual that continued until Walt graduated. Walt and Walter Pfeiffer entered amateur night at a local theater with Charlie Chaplin and the Count, Walt playing Chaplin in his father's derby pants and work shoes and a lamp-black mustache, similar to Groucho Marx, of course. They won the 4th prize of 25 cents. Rehearsing as Walt delivered newspapers, the two boys developed other acts. The two Walts, the boys from Benton School, and Hans and Mike. Walt sneaked out his bedroom window for the performances, realizing that his father would not approve. One night, Elias and Flora took their daughter for a rare visit to the neighborhood vaudeville house. A performer announced that he would stack 3 chairs over his head and balance a boy on top. The Disney parents were startled to discover that the boy atop their stack was their son, Walter. Whoops. In addition to his newspaper routes, Walt delivered prescriptions for a drugstore and sold newspapers on street corners. I wonder what his reaction would be to the musical Newsies. During the noon recess, he swept out the candy store across from school in return for a hot meal. Work became a constant, numbing routine. Sometimes, as he dressed before dawn, he fell asleep while tying his shoelaces. Small diversions gave him pleasure, like playing with a miniature train left on a customer's porch during the summer, or taking a few minutes from his deliveries for football or hockey with his friends. Roy looked, excuse me, Walt looked forward to the times when his brother Roy returned home. Roy had twice gone to work on his Uncle William's farm in Ellis, Kansas, walking part of the way and hitching rides on freight trains. Later, he was hired as teller at the First National Bank in Kansas City. Despite the difference in their ages, the two brothers maintained the same closeness they had known on the Marceline farm, and Roy provided counsel from his worldly experience. One day, Elias upbraided Walt for not handing him a tool fast enough. Walt's temper was as hot as his father's, and he replied sharply. Elias accused him of impertinence and ordered him to the basement for a thrashing. Roy overheard the exchange and confided to his brother, "Look, kid, he's got no reason for hitting you. You're 14 years old. Don't take it anymore." When Walt reached the basement, his father was still in a rage and he swung a hammer handle. Walt grabbed it away. Elias raised his hand to strike the boy. Walt held him by both wrists, and his father could not escape. Tears began to appear in Elias's eyes. Walt loosened his grip and climbed the stairs. His father never tried to thrash him again. Excuse me, I think I breathed wrong. Accustomed to his father's frugality, Walt rarely asked for anything for himself. But he longed for a pair of high leather boots with metal toes and decorated leather strips over the laces, arguing that the boots would be practical for delivering newspapers through the slush and rain. Flora Disney persuaded her husband to buy the boots, and at Christmas in 1916, Walt found them under the tree. He wore the boots every day as he trudged through his morning and afternoon deliveries. One early spring evening, Walt was finishing the Star route at 31st Street and Indiana, where he usually joined his friends for a soda at the drugstore. You'll have to forgive me. Without my glasses, I start losing my place, but it really is digging into my head. Thank you, Luther, for your tale. As he crossed the street, he kicked a piece of ice, then yelped in pain. A horseshoe nail had pierced the boot and jammed into his big toe. His foot was frozen fast to the ice. "Help, I'm stuck," he yelled. But a trolley muffled his shouts. For 20 minutes he endured excruciating pain, and no one offered assistance. Finally, a wagon driver chipped the ice loose and took Walt to a doctor's office. "That's my boy. That's my pretty boy. What is that stuck to you?" What's a Disney princess without her animal sidekick, I must ask you? Where was I? "Help, I'm stuck. Wagon driver." "Kid, I've got nothing to give you for the pain," the doctor said. "You'll just have to hang on." He assigned 2 men to hold Walt's legs. Then he pulled the nail out with pliers. Walt sweated in pain as the doctor removed the boot, opened the wound, and administered a tetanus inoculation. I do not want to know what... I've had tetanus shots myself, but I don't want to know what a tetanus shot felt like in those days. 2 weeks free from the ordeal of delivering the Times every morning gave Walt time to think about his future life. He discarded notions of being a doctor or lawyer. He realized he had been an indifferent student, and besides, none of the Disney sons had been afforded the luxury of a college education. The show world intrigued him. He had known no greater pleasure than performing before audiences, but he lacked the confidence to compete in big-time vaudeville. Cartooning interested him most. His drawings had evoked chuckles from the patrons of Bert Hudson's barbershop and his fellow students at the Benton School. He enjoyed the children's art classes at the Kansas City Art Institute more than his regular schoolwork. By the time Walt's foot healed and he returned to his newspaper routes, he had decided to become a cartoonist. By 1917, Elias Disney had been in Kansas City 7 years, and he was growing restless. The newspaper distributorship had not grown as he had hoped, and it was hard to find reliable delivery boys. A new business enterprise beckoned. For $16,000, Elias could acquire an interest in the Ozell Jelly Factory in Chicago, as well as the position of head of plant construction. He invested his entire savings, as well as $20 belonging to his son Walter. Imagine $20 in those days. Now, I can't do math very well, but that sounds like a ridiculous amount of money. Walt, who had graduated from Benton School on June 8, 1917, remained in Kansas City for the summer to help the new distributor with the newspaper route. Herbert Disney, who now had a wife and daughter, moved into the family house, and Walt and Roy continued living there. Roy suggested that Walt get a job on the railroad. Roy himself had worked 2 summers as news butcher for the Santa Fe, selling newspapers, cold drinks, fruit and candy to the travelers. Walt applied for a summer job with the Van Nuys Interstate News Company, claiming to be 16, although he was a year younger. The job required a $15 bond, which Roy supplied from his earnings at the bank. Walt was outfitted with a blue serge uniform with a badge on the lapel, and gold buttons marked Van Nuys Interstate. At the Van Nuys office in the Kansas City Railroad Station, he picked up hampers packed with fruit, popcorn, peanuts, candy bars, and soda pop. His first run was an 8-hour trip from Kansas City to Jefferson City, Missouri, and Walt placed the hampers in the news butcher's position on the 2 front seats of the smoking car. As the train pulled out of the station, Walt stood on the steps behind the conductor, hoping the youngsters on the platform would admire his uniform. It was a hot summer day, and Walt found many customers for soda pop in the commuter cars. Instead of walking back to the smoker, he placed the empty bottles in a box at the end of the train. After a couple of hours, he returned to collect the bottles. He was dismayed to find the commuter cars had vanished. Those cars are always detached at Lee's Summit, the conductor explained. Loss of the bottles wiped out Walt's first day profit. Roy chided his brother for allowing the company to stock his hampers with overripe fruit. Walt sometimes left the hampers unguarded and returned to find candy and cigars missing. Once he sold soda pop to soldiers who filled a tourist car. They amused themselves by hurling the empty bottles from the train. Walt complained to the brakeman, "Those guys threw my bottles out the window." The brakeman told the top sergeant, who made the soldiers pay for the lost bottles. Captain America would have had their buns for that. The romance of railroading was overwhelming for a 15-year-old whose only journeys had been from Chicago to Marceline and Marceline to Kansas City. He rode the Missouri Pacific, the Kansas City, Southern and Missouri, and the Kansas and Texas lines to towns and cities in a half-dozen states. One of his favorite runs was from Kansas City to Downs, Kansas, a slow 6-hour trip during which the train stopped at every station, sometimes pushing boxcars onto sidings to clear the track. Walt went forward to supply baggage men with cigars and chewing tobacco, then climbed over to the tender to the cab, where the engineer and fireman allowed him to ride for part of the journey. During long stopovers, Walt explored the towns and cities. That's not Luther's hair. That's my old cat's hair. Miss you, baby girl. One day in Downs, where the train turned around and refueled, Walt was strolling past the stores when a policeman accosted him. The boy was accused of surveying the town for a robbery. The officer was unconvinced by Walt's claim of innocence until the train crew verified that the boy was a news butcher. After all-day runs, Walt stayed overnight in railroad hotels or boarding houses. returning to Kansas City the following day. During a visit to Pueblo, Colorado, he recalled that a friendly salesman had recommended a place to stay. Walt located the address, and he was greeted warmly by a motherly woman in a green velvet robe. You can see where this is going. While she was gone, Walt admired the elegant furnishings and gold piano and wondered if the place were priced beyond his means. He heard laughter at the top of the red carpeted stairs, and a young cowboy and a pretty girl strolled down arm in arm. Walt suddenly realized he was not in the normal kind of boarding house, and he made a swift exit. I think there's about 15 Irish songs that go about like that. The summer travels had brought a new maturity to Walt, but no profit. The overripe fruit attracted flies, and the conductor made him throw it off the train. The empty bottles continued to disappear, and pilferage from the hampers added to the daily losses. Finally, Roy advised, "You'd better give it up, kid. You're not going to get ahead of the game, so you might as well just take your loss." Walt reluctantly agreed. Summer would soon be over, and he would be joining his parents in Chicago to begin high school. Roy took the loss. Roy forfeited to Van Nuys the $15 deposit that his brother had lent him. And that is the end of Unit 3, what is wrong with me? Unit 1, Chapter 3 of Walt Disney, An American Original by Bob Thomas. Today it looks about like I think we're all feeling. It's gray, it's overcast, it's dreary, which kind of matches up with the whole Dumbo theme for today, doesn't it? Haven't actually watched the film myself in about 25 years, don't intend on it. But again, I'd like to leave you with just a few encouraging remarks if I can. Oof! So even though we haven't watched the film together in decades, Dumbo is a very special film to me and my mom. Mrs. Jumbo never gave up on her baby, no matter what, and my mom has never once given up on me. Hold on to each other, okay? We're gonna get through this. So, M-I-C, see you real soon. K-E-Y, why? Because we like you. M-O-U